Good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege this afternoon to welcome Dr. Karen Mock for a very special conversation, not just for Yom Kippur, but at this special time, reflecting on 20 years since the Durban conference. Dr. Karen Mock is a decorated anti-racism campaigner. Karen, if I may call you that,
please.
Maybe you could start by just sharing some highlights of the work that you have done as an anti-racism campaigner, because we're really privileged to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to be here. I really come at this work, I guess you could call it a lifelong work in human rights and anti-racism, starting many, many years ago as a youth in the youth movement and being, I guess you could call it a child of the civil rights movement and participating with B'nai B'rith Youth Organization and the Anti-Defamation League. So that was my background, participating in the Israel Summer Institute as a teenager. So a combination of my Yiddishkeit and my being a lover of Israel, but at the same time, very much committed to human rights and anti-racism work. I'm an educational psychologist by training, so I do come at this as an educator and the importance not only of knowledge in the field, but also putting theory and policy into practice. You know, how do you make sure that in workplaces and in our society, we are really implementing the very policies that we have. And as you know, in Canada, many of our Canadian leadership has been in the area of human rights, even at the UN, you know, the International Declaration for Human Rights had a Canadian as one of the drafters, and the multiculturalism, anti-racism policies. And so this is who I am, and the importance of passing on the kind of knowledge base and the legacy and the institutional memory to the next generation of leaders who, I'm pleased to say, when I look at some of our Jewish organizations, are very much ready to take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this very brief introduction about your own work. And our listeners can also, of course, see your full bio posted in the links here to the video. So you were at the Durban conference. I'm sure most of our listeners have heard about the Durban conference, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So maybe you could just briefly describe for us what the 2001 Durban conference was supposed to be about.
They call it the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. And it was part of a series, I guess, every 10 years or so, a major conference that the UN would put on anti-racism. Canada actually was very engaged in all of this because they actually, at the UN, were the seconders to South Africa's resolution that was put forward at the General Assembly that there be an international conference, a UN conference on racism in 2001. And so in the lead up to Durban, there was the creation of a Canadian National Advisory Committee to the government to help prepare. At the time, I was head of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, an NGO. It's known internationally as the Anti-Defamation League, but this is the Canadian version. And Canadians usually say what they're for, not what they're against. So it was the League for Human Rights, had a little bit of a presence in lobbying and understanding the issues. And I was asked by the federal government to chair the Civil Society Advisory Committee to the Canadian government in the preparation. And so we had a very eclectic, representative, egalitarian kind of committee that assisted NGOs to get organized, did position papers, all the way in the lead up for the 2 years leading up to Durban.
So having done all of that work, what were your expectations for the conference? Were you full of hope?
Very much so. Some of us went into it a little bit blindly initially. We were full of hope because of the scope of the topic, because we thought that this was going to make a huge difference for our country creating a national action plan against racism, because you know that when countries sign on to a UN declaration that comes out of a conference, it's merely a declaration, but it's their commitment that they're going to create their own action plan domestically. So that was the hope in Canada. What we were not prepared for was that people would end up dividing on racial and racialized lines. In Canada, up until the Durban process, we would have an education caucus or a health organization or working on policing issues, and they would be multiracial, multicultural kinds of groups or organizations. Yes, we had the Congress of Black Women, and yes, we had B'nai B'rith, and we had specific organizations, but they were more for cultural and lobbying for effective treatment and so on. But when it came to anti-racism initiatives, we would be together. We had not realized until the PrepCom processes that people were dividing up into caucuses. And that's when, even on our own advisory committee, we ended up, even though I was chair and I had an African Canadian co-chair and an Indigenous co-chair, even so, at that time, in the lead up, because it seemed to be the culture of the UN process, we would have a Black caucus and other caucuses who would come and make resolutions to our group. So that was where we were a little bit naive going into it. But the expectation still was that this was going to be a huge impetus for our work together when we came back.
So, and indeed, it was that Kofi Annan, who was the UN Secretary General at the time, and Mary Robinson, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, had indeed established these lofty goals for the conference, that it would help nations to produce a new blueprint to tackle racism and xenophobia. But we all know something quite different unfolded. The Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, who was supposed to be in Durban and I think ended up boycotting the actual conference, I'm not entirely sure, you will correct me if I'm wrong, was quoted as saying, the conference in Durban will go down in history as an enterprise of disgrace instead of being an important international conference that expresses goodwill. The conference was turned into a circus of calumny. Based on your first-person experiences, what happened in Durban?
Well, we had the warning signs in the lead up, in the PrepComs on the way. I can remember reaching out to my colleagues in the Jewish community 2 years before, saying we should all get ready for this. And they said things like, well, Karen, anti-racism, that's your issue. So it wasn't as if there was a lot of interest. We in Canada had the national consultation. In February, we got a group going, and there were youth, because there was going to be a youth conference as well as an NGO forum. And it was in February that the PrepCom was held in Tehran. And the PrepCom meaning preparatory committee meeting. Right. And the whole purpose of any of these UN conferences is to create a declaration. So the preparatory committee meetings start drafting and start moving in. Well, the Tehran PrepCom Tehran refused to allow the Jewish organizations and Israel to participate in the PrepCon. The writing was on the wall. And in the NGO beginnings of the declarations, you started to see people lobbying to bring the Zionism is racism declaration back. At that point, you asked for a personal account. I'm going to try to be brief. At that point, I did what probably you're familiar with rabbinic students or graduate students doing. They'll send emails around to leaders and say, hello, I'm doing this, and here's who I am. Are you interested? And that's what I did. I didn't know some of the people, but I sent to the World Jewish Congress. I sent to the International Simon Wiesenthal. I sent to B'nai B'rith International, to Hadassah International, any of the organizations that had what they called ECOSOC standing, which meant that we could go as NGOs. And I said, they are creating caucuses. The writing is on the wall. We need to create a Jewish caucus. Who will be your representatives in Geneva at the preparatory committee meeting? Because what they called the second preparatory committee meeting, but it was really the first for the NGOs, was going to be in Geneva. And it would be in May, the conference being in September, August, September. And some things are beshert. When I went and there were, about 200 seats to choose from for the NGO briefing, I sat down and I introduced myself to the person next to me, who happened to be from B'nai B'rith in Geneva. And he said, oh, you're Karen Mock. There's somebody over there who's looking for you. And when they saw I was B'nai B'rith, they thought I knew you. And sure enough, there was Sybil from Hadassah, and there was Shimon from Simon Wiesenthal, people that I didn't know, but they were looking for me because we knew that we needed, because there was going to be a Palestinian caucus, and there was going to be this caucus and that caucus, and we would not have a voice. We would not be able to speak with our own voice to the General Assembly or to others if we didn't have a caucus. And so in Geneva, in May, was the founding of the first meeting of the International Jewish Caucus. We, again, could see the writing on the wall. It ended up that there had to be another PrepCon, which they did not expect in Geneva, because of the vitriol, because of how tense things had started to become, mostly vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and raising this up as a racial issue, which, of course, we considered it to be quite a political issue, but not an issue for the anti-racism conference. We actually had a meeting with Mary Robinson in Geneva, our caucus. And at the same time, Rabbi Melchior, who was head of the, he was the foreign minister at the time from Israel, he even held a luncheon for all of us from all the different countries' delegations. And he said that, I still blush when I hear it. He said, I want to thank Karen Mock for being the miracle of Durban, because she brought together the Jewish organizations who ordinarily are competing with each other. But here we were in solidarity, strategizing around how are we going to make sure that we came to Durban to do what Durban needed to do and not let it get co-opted by that agenda. But sadly, when we arrived, by the way, I should tell you that Shimon Samuels and I, he from Simon Wiesenthal, me from the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith, we went to observe the international steering committee of the NGOs that were planning the NGO forum. And we were there as observers because it's an open meeting. There was even a Canadian delegate there. And here we are in Geneva, and somebody stops the meeting and says, There are two people at the back observing who are agents of a government, who are government agents.
Wow.
And they meant Israel.
And of course, neither of you, I don't know Shimon, but I'm assuming neither of you are actually Israeli citizens even.
No, not at all. He's from France. I'm from Canada. You know, Simon Wiesenthal, a well-respected ECOSOC standing, B'nai B'rith, well-respected ECOSOC standing. And I said, I'm here. Yes, I'm on the Canadian delegation, but I am chair of the NGO advisory committee. And that was the tone, even at the NGO forum. So we arrived to the NGO forum. It's opened up, 7,000 people in a huge stadium in Durban, and big signs, pro-Palestinian signs, anti-Israel signs. And the woman from Sangoko, it's the South African NGO Coordinating Committee, Sangoko. She opens up the conference, an Afrikaans woman, and she is wearing a keffiyeh strapped around her neck. When we arrived also to check in, you had the Arab Lawyers Union circulating material that had the Magen David with a superimposition of the swastika on it.
Wow.
And so on. So as a matter of fact, it was not the least bit subtle. And I have all the documentation, the young people, the WUJs, you know, the World Union of Jewish Students and the European Jewish Students Union gathered together a brochure that had all of the propaganda pieces. Things like, what if we saw pamphlets being circulated? What if Hitler had won? Well, the good thing would be that there wouldn't be an Israel, and Palestinians wouldn't be in the situation they are. And the bad thing is they wouldn't have made the new Beetle, the new Volkswagen Beetle. And this kind of nonsense, this kind of things that looked as if they were just updated Arabic type versions of blood libels or something right out of the Stürmer. This is what was being openly distributed and circulated. The NGO forum is often conflated with the government forum. None of that was allowed in the government forum, which started at the end. The government forum started on the Friday, and the NGO forum ended that Saturday. That Friday morning, because the NGO final forum and final declaration for the NGOs was going to be Shabbat morning, I went Friday morning to the steering committee to implore them to hold it later in the evening after sundown so that we could all participate.
Right.
They refused to make religious accommodation. But when Castro's speech went on way too long on that Saturday, and when the Spanish translation hadn't been finished on time, they made linguistic accommodation and said, we can't have the forum until after dinner because we don't have the Spanish translation available yet. Now, there were people there who came to our, quotes, rescue, and Friday, some of the other NGOs said, we will bring the Anti-Semitism Commission's recommendations forward for you. And speaking of the Anti-Semitism Commission, there were commissions in these big tents. Commission meant that you raise the issue and your caucus was able to submit recommendations.
Right.
We had to go beg for there to be an Anti-Semitism Commission. There was going to be a commission on every other ism and every other phobia, and there was going to be a Palestinian commission. But they finally agreed that we could have an Anti-Semitism Commission. We had it and had to have a plan B ready because it was stormed by a large group of pro-Palestinian activists who wanted all the resolutions to be voted on so that they could vote down our resolutions. And our plan B, I was facilitating this forum, this commission. Our plan B was that I would use every ounce of psychological, empathetic communication I could, and could say, I hear that there are those who would like to be heard, and therefore we are going to break up into discussion groups so that we can, and they didn't want to, they wanted to do it in the plenary. But we immediately had our facilitators so that we could break out into discussion groups. They got frustrated. We got all of our recommendations done because maybe they would be in one group and they would try to do that, but we could still get our recommendations done. And sadly, on that Friday, which also happened to be a day of solidarity with Palestinians, there was a huge march and a huge demonstration. And just to show you that, in fact, it is anti-Semitic.
Right.
When they were doing their demonstration and wanting to lobby, they didn't circle the place where the government forum was. They circled the Durban Jewish Club. That was going to be where our Shabbat dinner was.
Wow.
We had to have escorts. So they didn't circle where the resolutions were going to be made. They circled a Jewish organization. And we had to wait it out until the demonstration was over and then go have our Shabbat dinner.
Wow.
So the signs, the ethos there was so anti-Jewish and so anti-Israel. Many of our colleagues in the Black community, in the Roma community, in the Asian community, they were upset because it distracted the attention away from the issues that we all felt were so important that needed to be resolved. Many of our Jewish colleagues could only find safety or a safe space to have these conversations in the intersectionality caucus. And I would go there with some of my Black Canadian and Muslim Canadian friends who were there in solidarity to work on these issues together. And at least we could feel that we could have these kinds of reasonable conversations. But they were right, the people that said that there was horrific anti-Semitism at an anti-racism conference. That even our own efforts to have a press conference and to speak positively about what's going on and were stormed, and we were out hollered. I don't know how else to say it. It was, now again, this did not happen at the government forum. However, as you know, the United States and Israel walked out on day 2 of the actual government forum. Some people say that the US walked out because they wanted to avoid the issues on reparations, but it was also because of the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic kinds of language that they were hearing in the negotiations. As the UN is wont to do, they take all the contentious sections out of the main, and they negotiate backstage, so to speak.
Yeah.
The government of Israel, I mean, no government can tell another government what to do, but the Israeli delegation encouraged those of us who were Jewish and were on official delegations for our countries, like Australia, like Canada, and so on. They encouraged us to stay because what do NGOs do best? Lobby, and lobby people in the lobbies. And we were ready because we had our declaration and we had our ways of supporting our own negotiators. And the government of Canada, I know, did outstanding negotiations and kept the negative language. They were part of the group along with Australia and others, who kept the really negative language against Israel out of the government declaration. They call it the Declaration of Program and Program of Action. The only place that it's mentioned is in section 151. And it says, as for the situation in the Middle East, calls for, meaning we call for, the end of violence and the swift resumption of negotiations, respect for international human rights and humanitarian law, respect for the principle of self-determination, and the end of all suffering, thus allowing Israel and the Palestinians to resume the peace process and to develop and prosper in security and freedom. We do have to point out, however, that yes, the government of Israel said they could live with that, and so it got into the declaration. But in that entire declaration and program of action, Israel is the only country that is named by name. China's not named, Syria's not named, any other state where there are human rights violations is not named. So while Mary Robinson refused to accept the NGO declaration as an official document because of the vilification of Israel in it, actual vilification. I mean, the technicality was that they used the term genocide, and it was not in keeping with the proper UN definition of genocide. So they refused to accept it as a document that could be tabled as the voice of civil society. But in spite of all that, the Durban process still raises heart palpitations in many of us who actually had to live through it.
Yeah, thank you. So I think for many of us, what we are most familiar with about Durban is this equation of Zionism and racism, which it didn't make into the formal government declaration, or the accusation of referring to Israel as an apartheid state. Again, it's not in the formal government declaration. Nonetheless, I think I want to just take a moment to talk about this comparison of Israel as an apartheid state, because similar accusations have just recently been leveled against Israel. Again, Human Rights Watch just published a very lengthy report entitled "A Threshold Crossed," where it said Israel is acting as an apartheid state. As someone who has been at Durban, but also as someone who is really an experienced anti-racism campaigner, how do you see that comparison of Israel as an apartheid state?
Well, what started in Durban has culminated in that recent report and in what seems to be a turning point in the aftermath of the May Gaza-Israel flare-up again. In the NGO declaration, to show how highly politicized the language was and where all of this started to really take a foothold, the article that was in the NGO declaration states, targeted victims of Israel's brand of apartheid and ethnic cleansing methods have been in particular children, women, and refugees. Article 425 announces a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. This is what the NGO declaration was calling for. Quotes, the imposition of mandatory and comprehensive sanctions and embargoes and full cessation of all links, diplomatic, economic, social aid, military cooperation, and training between all states and Israel. And then a further article talks of condemnation of those states who are supporting, aiding, and abetting the Israeli apartheid state and its perpetration of racist crimes against humanity, including ethnic cleansing and acts of genocide. So every one of the worst crimes of the 20th century is fielded against Israel and only Israel. And what started to take that kind of foothold in Durban, the boycotts, the divestment, the sanctions, and so on, and this rhetoric, this inflammatory, over-the-top rhetoric, culminated in the recent Human Rights Watch report. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and the other groups that were there, they woke up to what was going on in Durban way too late. They didn't see it until the actual forum that was after sundown, so our group had to go. But we ended up having to walk out even of that NGO forum. Why? Because the rule that the National Coordinating Committee, the International Coordinating Committee set for that declaration was that every victim group was entitled to define its own terminology and its own oppression. But very soon into the conversation, a group got up and made a motion to remove one of the sections from the anti-Semitism. And we were one of the only flags, I had it in my hand because I was heading the delegation, held up to vote against what that group had proposed, and we were voted down. So it was the rule for all NGOs that they could define their own terminology, but when it came to our submission, they were going to change the rules. So we had no choice but to walk out. So this language, even some of the people in Human Rights Watch recently were concerned before the report came out because they knew that the language in a way was being manipulated. Obviously, the term apartheid is used and people immediately think of South African apartheid, but they define it in such a way as it could apply to what is happening certainly in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. But they fudge it over into acts of discrimination and inequities in Israel itself. Well, on that basis, Canada could be called an apartheid state, or any country where there is actual evidence of systemic bias in employment or in law and systemic treatment and policies. And of course, people like us who believe in human rights speak out against those violations in Israel. But to specifically use that terminology and accuse Israel of crimes against humanity. I mean, Israel's being accused of the very crime that at Nuremberg, the Nazis were held accountable for. And so what started in Durban has simply escalated, and through what many of us would call propaganda techniques, you just repeat it often enough, without the data, without the background, without the official definition. I mean, at least Mary Robinson could say, this is the definition of genocide, and Israel has not committed genocide. That rhetoric in those sections are over the top. We cannot accept this declaration and table it as the voice of civil society.
So what you're talking about, I just want to connect it a little bit for us, for our listeners, to what we've been seeing also in the UK. The British comedian and writer David Baddiel just published a book in 2021 entitled Do Stone Count, where he says that the progressive idea that it is the prerogative of those experiencing racism is to say, this is racism, seems to apply to everyone but the Jews. You just shared for us this kind of how you observed this happening in Durban when it came to the declarations around anti-Semitism. As the co-chair of the International Jewish Caucus, because you haven't mentioned that you were actually the co-chair of the International Jewish Caucus at Durban, what do you think this connection, how do you think, you spoke a little bit about it already, but how do you see this connection of what happened in Durban to what we're seeing today in progressive circles. And it is happening in the UK. I think in the UK, we saw it primarily in the discussion around anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, but we are also seeing it around the world in the United States, in the Black Lives Matters movement, and so on. Do you see a connection? How do you see that connection to what you were witnessing in Durban?
I do see the connection, and I see it especially because when I think of the generation that has grown up between 2001 and 2021, many of the young people who are in leadership positions now, or they may even be professors in universities, or they may be graduate students, or they may be young lawyers, they have grown up with this kind of rhetoric in progressive circles, in anti-racism circles. They have grown up with even academic boycotts of Israel because it's, quote unquote, an apartheid state. And they don't have the knowledge or background of the UN, of how it works, of, what is law and what isn't law, what are definitions and what isn't. I mean, I've got people spouting off international law to me when it may be the recommendation in a report. It's not a law, or it might be a resolution in a UN declaration, but that doesn't make it law. And yet they're saying Israel is constantly violating international law. Well, what does that mean? I mean, when we came home from Durban, now you do need to remember, of course, that, I came home on 9/10 that night. And 9/11 happened the next morning. And I remember having tears that night before. We had to remain strong in Durban on very little sleep to get all these resolutions going and our strategies. But I even said to my husband, when is the world going to wake up to the power of hate and hate propaganda and what it can really do? Because I even had a South African lawyer who was drafting the NGO declaration in Geneva say to me, but Karen, in Israel, you're not allowed to vote if you're not Jewish. And I looked at him and I said, you are a lawyer. Where did you get that information? Because that's what he believed. He believed it was an apartheid state and you couldn't hold positions or vote if you were not Jewish. I said, there are Arab and non-Jewish and Palestinian and Muslim members of the Knesset. So what started in Durban has infiltrated, I'm going to use that language, into anti-racist education, equity and social justice education. We have university departments right here in Canada that are teaching teachers how to prepare to teach classes on social justice education. And they deal with every single one of the isms and phobias in their curriculum, but not anti-Semitism. And so when things happen in the classroom, and when people are just repeating these mantras, they have no knowledge base as educators to deal with that. And they don't have the skills as empathetic listeners to handle if there's tension on a political issue in the classroom. So there is a direct connection with what started in Durban, with the proliferation of the BDS movement, with the even though it's not on the books anymore, Zionism is racism has been long since repudiated, but they are still being taught that Zionism is racism in their work. And they are repudiating anyone who attempts to, yes, speak out against human rights violations, but at the same time, not vilify Israel over any other state or call for its dismantling or its destruction.
I mean, your experiences in Durban really do sound pretty traumatic. And then of course, the combination of returning just before 9/11 and the trauma that was experienced really for our world, actually, for the Western world, the trauma of 9/11. How did you personally heal from that experience, and where did you find strength to continue to your anti-racism work? Because it wouldn't be so surprising to hear someone say, you know, I fought really hard and it was terrible and I'm just done. Where did you find your strength? Because you didn't stop there. You continue to be an anti-racism activist.
Actually, I was sitting in the Durban Jewish Club on the telephone with Ottawa at the same time as my contract was being negotiated to become the head of what we call the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So that is what some other countries might call a government commission. But it is the organization that is a crown corporation that is to be speaking out against all forms of racism and to have the institutional memory and make sure to pass that on so that never again can these kinds of things happen in Canada. It was founded as part of the redress to Japanese Canadians as their gift to all of the rest of Canada to ensure that those rights would not be violated. And so I certainly found solace with others who were prepared to work together. Although when I arrived, my position actually started in October, and they were just about to release their post 9/11 strategies to, first of all, reporting on some of the data of the racism that had happened afterwards and giving some very concrete guidelines on what to do should that happen. And they documented all the incidents, but they didn't document the rise in anti-Semitic incidents.
Interesting.
And so since the final draft wasn't done yet, I was able to get them to insert one line that gave similar data because, of course, there was a huge rise in anti-Semitic incidents because Jews were being blamed by many for 9/11. So it was just by reaching out to other colleagues, by having the commitment when there was talk about should there be a Durban+1. And of course, people didn't want to have a Durban+1. The Canadian government was shying away from it completely and had gone into a post 9/11 security kind of anti-terrorism mode, which of course was fraught with its own systemic racist pieces that we had to deal with. But I instead said, well, if the government isn't going to do it, and because we need to do the healing and we need to bring people together. So the Canadian Race Relations Foundation hosted Durban+1 and brought back people from the Canadian delegation, from the different NGOs, and made an appeal to our then Minister of Multiculturalism, which included anti-racism, that we needed to do our own action plan and put the good parts of Durban and the Durban Declaration into action, not the NGO one. Now, yes, there was still healing to do, but I'm a cockeyed optimist. There were people who I can remember sitting around the planning table, and I was the only Jewish person in the room, in my office, at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, with some of the people from NGOs that had been on the Canadian delegation of all backgrounds. And we were brainstorming about who should be guest speakers, and someone's name came up. And then the group had this whole conversation about what was and wasn't anti-Semitism. And so accused the group of being anti-Semitic, and that's not carrying on. Not once did anyone turn to me. When, of course, if I had been a Black person and the topic was racism, they wouldn't have been arguing about what was and wasn't racism. They would have turned to me to say, help us understand. Now, again, maybe it's the old teacher in me. I didn't choose, because there was only 5 minutes left in the meeting. I did not choose to raise that issue then. You need to choose your time, and you have to have the right forum for it. We dealt with it at the next meeting when we had time to discuss what was and wasn't anti-Semitism. But we're still fighting that battle now. The other way that there was some healing is we had a little private group called the DS group, Durban Survivors. People from some of the NGOs in different parts of the world who continue to communicate with each other and to try to strategize about how are we going to make sure that the Durban sensibility didn't take over. And so we stayed together, and we actually met in New York in February of 2001, and we stayed in touch, and we're still in touch.
Wow.
As any of these anniversaries come up, and what should we do? At one point, we thought it was going to be a good thing to review and have a Durban review. And we worked hard as NGOs around the world to get the NGOs to declare that this would never happen again and to set guidelines.
Right.
And we had about 92 different organizations signed on. And then the governments got involved and got political, and they turned it into a political football. And the conservative parties in the different countries scream and yell and say, you never should have been in Durban in the first place. And they make points. And then the governments took over, and different governments decided to boycott, whether it was Durban+1 or Durban+10 or whatever.
So it is Durban+20. And in fact, just as you're observing with different countries boycotting, the UK just recently announced to join Canada, the US, and Australia in boycotting the 20th anniversary event of the Durban Conference. They list historic concerns about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred as their reason. Do you feel boycott is the right move here?
At one point, we thought it wasn't the right move. And what I find funny is even the use of the term boycott, because of course, all these same groups would say we shouldn't have boycott against Israel, but we can boycott other things as a nonviolent protest measure. But here's what I think. Why invoke Durban? Why remind everybody? Why use that as the model? Because what the governments do and what the UN does is say, recalling this and recalling that, and they do all these preambles. Why do we want to recall Durban? And so I wouldn't call it a boycott. I would say that every country should stand up and merely say that racism and all other forms of discrimination are not acceptable and demand an effective response here at home, in the UK, in Canada, in the US, you name it, to counter racism at home and internationally. So we want countries to do that anyway. Durban's not the appropriate mechanism or reminder to set an international agenda, because it recalls how that conference was in fact corrupted and the bias that was evident, the anti-Semitic bias that was evident. And I'm not one to say criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. You know that. You can criticize policies of every country that are inappropriate and that are racist. But to say that Durban, when all the other groups are held up and only one is stigmatized as the model, no, we just don't need that. And as I said earlier, the Israel-Palestine conflict is not a racial conflict. It's not an anti-racism issue. Are there components of it? Are some people racialized? Yes, but it's not a racial or a religious issue. It's a political issue. And So when you have a document that names only one country out of all the countries in the entire UN, so I think they should stay away from commemorating Durban 20. It's just not helpful. They need to identify and support alternative, non-discriminatory actions. Yes, every country should have its own action plan against racism and all forms of xenophobia and related intolerance, as that title suggested. But should they be using Durban framework as their model? Absolutely not. When it alienates one community so viciously and vocally, no. I think that the Jewish community has proved historically that it is one of the most internationally minded and humanitarian communities in the world. Is there this awful situation in Israel and Palestine right now? Yes. Do we need to find ways to get those countries, or the Palestinians and Israel rather, to the table? And do all the countries that have any kind of clout, are they committed to finding true peace and a peaceful resolution and the end to an occupation? Sure, let them do that, but not using the Durban framework. We don't need to celebrate Durban 20. We need to forget about Durban and think about that hope and that promise that many of us felt going into it, and bring that to our actions in our own countries and internationally as well.
So we do sadly have to wrap up our fascinating conversation, but as you are bringing us to look toward the future, and as you reflect really on the commitment, the Jewish commitment, the commitment of the Jewish people to be passionate about these progressive causes, especially for progressive Jews, who really truly want to make a contribution to overcoming racism. And I think the past year we've seen in many countries around the world a sort of reckoning of having to deal more with the continuing institutionalized racism that we see in our societies, whether that is in the UK, the United States, Canada, or Israel. But at the same time, we do encounter many of the challenges that you as an activist in Durban encountered. We do encounter some of these challenges in the anti-racism work in our own countries. Can you just to close this conversation, say a few words about how you see the future for Jewish involvement in anti-racism work?
Well, I certainly hope that there will be continued Jewish involvement and activism in anti-racism work. I'm not giving up. It's the next generation that needs to take up the cause. And what I am frightened about is you cannot do this work in sound bites and without taking the time to really know the history and know all the narratives and build relationships. And there's an old saying, physician, heal thyself. Right now, we have people in the progressive spaces who have been trained and are champions against anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, you name it. But they do not self-reflect on how systemic anti-Semitism actually is in their circles. And they have adopted the mantra that anytime Jewish people raise the issue of anti-Semitism, it's just to silence pro-Palestinian voices. And to me, that's no different than when white supremacists would say when they were being trained, or there were things happening in workplaces or in schools around anti-Black racism. And they would turn around and say, you're just trying to stifle my freedom of speech. Or we had a situation here where against Muslims, where people in magazines and newspapers were saying, we shouldn't be defining Islamophobia because you're just trying to silence our criticism, which is simply not true. So we need to keep involved in this work. And we need also to build the kind of time in. This last year has been almost a disaster in that regard. It's just been a disaster, because trying even to do this kind of work over Zoom, I've been asked to do training sessions where, without being able to tell the stories, without being able to have the time, without being able to sit with a person at the coffee break and do the active listening. And then you get that glimmer of recognition in their eye when they realize that there's been that inconsistency. We can't give up, Leah. The kind of work that you're doing in your congregation, the kind of work that Holy Blossom is doing, the kind of work that the J-Space Canada is doing, that so many of the organizations are doing. We can't give up, and we need, in my respectful view, more solidarity even within our own communities, because there is diversity in our community, and vilifying each other is not the route to go. One organization can't do it all. One organization may be fantastic at lobbying, but they're not so good at education or dialogue. And dialogue is not, I'll have dialogue with you if I can convince you to do it my way. So we've always said it's about putting yourself in the other's shoes. And that's what our work is about and needs to continue to be about. And my hope is with the next generations that will agree to do this and take the charge.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to end. And really, I think also your call on us to not vilify each other, to say that true dialogue is also about dialoguing with people who we might not see eye to eye with immediately, and that we shouldn't just turn away and give up. What a beautiful message to end on. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I hope we didn't commemorate Durban in a sense, but use this as an opportunity to kind of do that learning that you're imploring us to do, to understand the connections, to move a little bit beyond the soundbite. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege. And I'm sure many people will, after listening to us, say, can we have a bit more? So maybe there will be a second conversation at some point, moving beyond Durban, or maybe we'll forget about recalling Durban and find a different title to reflect together on the work that still lies ahead, for there is always work that lies ahead. But for now, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your unbelievable work throughout your entire life, at Durban, beyond Durban. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful year ahead, a sweet year.
Absolutely. Shana Tova to you.
Shana Tova.